The Mongol conquests were the most successful in history. They conquered the largest empire in pre-modern times, stretching from the tropics to the Arctic and spanning the whole continent of Asia. Kick-started by possibly the greatest military genius of all time, Genghis Khan, they killed something in the range of 50 million people. All of this really begs the question, what if the Mongol invasions never occurred? How would history be different if these horse tribes had never struck outwards, terrorizing the rest of the world? How would that change the rest of history, demographics, culture, and borders? That's the question of this alternate history. Figuring out the news sucks. I used to filter through so many news sources to just get a decent understanding of what's going on in the modern world. Our sponsor, BREW, is a really great way of dealing with this. BREW sends you an email every day, Monday through Saturday, with the latest news in business, tech, and finance. It's really convenient that you can just read informative, snappy, relevant, and witty summaries of the current situation in 5 minutes while drinking whatever your morning beverage is. It beats a lot of the older news where you have to wade through lots of dry material to see what's really important. It also beats just reading headlines or scrolling through social media aimlessly. Something interesting I learned is that the World Trade Organization just appointed their first black woman, Nigerian Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. It was also interesting to read about the massive ice storm wrecking the American South, which I've heard some of my friends down there tell me about, or alternatively that Bill Gates is writing a book about how to forestall the worst effects of climate change. With all this going on, there's no reason to not download BREW. It's completely free and takes 15 seconds to subscribe to. Click the link in the description and start making yourself smarter today. The main driving factor behind the Mongol conquests is Genghis Khan's genius and his ability to hone the Mongol horse tribes into a coherent and loyal military force that no one could match. Without his genius, which first unified the Mongols and then created a highly efficient military structure, the Mongol conquest would just never have happened. There was some other stuff, like the medieval warm period as provoking droughts in Mongolia that pushed tribes outwards, but droughts happen all the time without provoking world conquest. Similarly, the civilizations that Genghis Khan conquered were generally pretty healthy states that weren't just begging to be conquered, like a lot are in history. So this timeline starts by just removing Genghis Khan. This timeline has a strongly regional pattern, and so I'm going to focus on different regions of the world to see how having no Mongol invasions would affect them. The area that had the largest broad societal effects due to the Mongol conquests was Central Asia. The Mongols were able to do two absolutely spectacular things here. Firstly, they completely wiped out several countries. One of these was Khwarazm or Khorasan, a densely populated Persian-speaking nation in modern Uzbekistan and Central Asia. Genghis Khan burned all the cities in this region to the ground and destroyed the irrigation canals, committing what in real terms amounted to genocide in a desert country. The area became settled afterwards by Turkic Uzbeks. If this never occurs, Khwarazm survives as a large Middle Eastern country in this area. Khorasan was one of the major centers of the Islamic world beforehand, on par with areas like Iran or Egypt. This continues in this timeline, with Khorasan remaining a large, densely populated country until the present day. The Uzbek people who replaced the Khwarezmids fathered Tamerlane, one of the greatest conquerors in history, coming in as the fourth greatest mass murderer of all time, ahead of Hitler by 5 million deaths. He was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, so there's no way he would have existed in this timeline. He's such an influential figure that I've already made an alternate history about if he never existed, the link to which is in the description. Some of the major long-term effects that hold over from this timeline are that the Mughal Empire, descendants of him, never forms, which means that the British and Dutch split India. Similarly, Iran remains majority Sunni, with the Shia becoming a tiny minority of Islam, and the Ottoman Empire seizes Austria, thus provoking German unification earlier. The second major thing that the Mongols did in Central Asia was turn the steppe peoples into Mongols. Let me explain. The Mongol army that invaded Europe was only about 10% ethnic Mongol. The rest were ethnic Turks like Tatars, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, etc. The Mongols in their conquests were able to assimilate a massive region of Central Asia. In 1800, a majority of Crimea considered themselves to be ethnically Mongol, but had practically no Mongol ancestry. This never occurs in this timeline. Another major effect of the Mongols upon world history was that they moved gophers from Yunnan and southwestern China to the Eurasian steppe. I'm not joking. These Chinese gophers brought bubonic plague to the Central Asian groundhog population, and this resulted in the Black Death. The Eurasian grasslands became reservoirs for plague that spread more easily due to the ease of trade under the Mongol Empire. I'm going to be cynical here and say something similar to the Black Death would still have occurred even without the Mongols. You see, there are multi-century secular cycles in which once population density hits a certain threshold and globalization gets to a certain point, a plague hits. In the 6th, 3rd, and 5th centuries BC, outbreaks of disease, 2 of which actually were bubonic plague, killed half of the population in bureaucratic urban societies. Similarly, 1/4 of the world's population died in the 17th century, in a large part due to plague outbreaks. To be fair, if only 1/4 of Eurasia's population died rather than half, that would still have massive effects upon history. However, I have no idea if that would happen, and so I choose to ignore it. The Mongols really racked up a high body count in China. Genghis Khan probably killed 35 million people here. For a perspective, that's roughly as many people as died in the entire European theater of World War II. Genghis Khan viewed the farmers as sheep and thought the land was better pasture land than farmland. The Chinese minister who convinced Genghis that tax-paying Chinese citizens had more value to produce the luxury goods the Mongols wanted alive than dead is still famous in China today. However, most of these deaths were concentrated in northern China, while the south remained generally demographically unscathed. China before the Mongols was divided into 3. There was the native Chinese Song dynasty that controlled the south, while the north was controlled by the Manchurian Jurchen nomadic tribes, alongside the Tongut Tibetan population in modern Gansu province. The Mongols were actually the ones that unified China, and it stayed unified ever since. I actually don't think that China would unify if the Mongols didn't do it. The South Chinese Song dynasty was militarily pathetic for a variety of reasons, as South Chinese armies have generally been ever since. However, if the Song Chinese were pathetic in open battle, fighting on their own terrain behind their own fortifications, they were practically indestructible. The Mongols, the greatest conquerors in history led by Kublai, one of the greatest conquerors ever, were only barely able to defeat the Song Chinese in a nasty multi-year war. In real terms, North and South China generally make sense as different countries. They have very different climates with a mountain chain separating them. They're based around different river systems as well. The North's control of the South before the Mongol conquest was heavily predicated upon the North's massive demographic advantage. However, after 1000 AD, the South's population grew to a far greater degree than the North's due to advances in rice cultivation, thus making sense for the South splitting off as an independent power base due to its greater power. China's really the exception in world history for maintaining a generally coherent empire for thousands of years on the scale it did. In this timeline, North China developed as an independent state with heavy steppe influences from areas like Manchuria and Mongolia. North China would be facing towards Inner Asia and would be much more militaristic. South China, meanwhile, would be in the subtropics and tropics, and be entirely culturally Han and be navally focused. The Mongols drove the Tangut population of Gansu extinct in our timeline. The Tanguts were a Tibetan people that founded a local dynasty, mixing with the native Chinese population. I honestly don't think they'd last in this timeline, although the region would still have a Tibetan ethnic component today. Dynasties don't tend to last in Gansu for very long, since the geography leaves the area so open to attacks. Chinese civilization was in a pretty good technological and economic place before the Mongol conquest. The Song dynasty was one of the civilizational high points of Chinese history. And the North Chinese were in the process of starting what could have been an industrial revolution. North China was producing more cast iron in 1100 than anyone else would until mid-19th century industrialized Britain. The Chinese of this era discovered gunpowder, the compass, and the printing press. However, Confucian civilization prevented the Chinese from fully using these. Confucianism, the dominant ideology of the ruling classes, distrusts anything new. The Chinese bureaucracy regulated their industrial revolution to death before the Mongols ever showed up since they distrusted the merchants. Similarly, the Chinese never used gunpowder to the same lethal effect as the Europeans did. All of this was just accentuated by the Mongol conquest. The Mongols were so horrible to the Chinese that they provided a profound reaction in China against foreigners or against anything really new afterwards. The Ming dynasty that came after the Chinese was a profoundly autocratic and paranoid state. The state tried to control every aspect of society, weakening the merchants and military and regulating life. One of the most important aspects here is they made the examination system to get into the government highly regularized and unimaginative, thus resulting in the Chinese state being controlled by unimaginative and bureaucratic people for centuries afterwards. Chinese society was based around people trying to get government jobs and using that to buy land to support their families. There really wasn't a strong market or noble aristocracy. Thus, when the government changed what the exams asked for, they were changing the society in marked ways. This meant that Chinese society became profoundly more conservative and close-minded. This paranoia and lack of creativity had the effect of preventing China from adopting Western technology like the Japanese did for much longer. Similarly, the Ming didn't like outward voyages from China and thus banned them, thus preventing China from ever having a colonial empire. In this timeline, China adapts to Western technology centuries earlier. Some traumatic event would still have occurred to shake China out of its stasis, but I'm guessing that would occur in the 19th rather than 20th centuries. China would follow a similar trajectory to Japan, industrializing in the 19th rather than the turn of the 21st centuries. The Mongol effect in the Middle East is difficult to calibrate. They seem to have accentuated a lot of long-term trends that were already in place. For example, the scientific golden age of Islam had already ground to a halt a couple centuries before, but the Mongols sped up the process towards Islamic religious orthodoxy by having such a brutal and irrational force show up, and also burning the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Perhaps without such a horrifying and traumatizing event as the Mongol invasions, the Shia Reformation of the 16th century would have taken full form. For those of you that don't know, Shia communities in the area between Turkey and Iran were having a major revival and reformation in the 16th century that was crushed by Sunni orthodoxy in the Ottoman Empire and Shia fanaticism in the Persian Safavid. Perhaps in this timeline this doesn't happen. Perhaps Islam has a religious revival and escapes the unscientific Sunni orthodoxy that developed in our timeline. This is such a wild card I have trouble predicting it at all, however. Similarly, the Mongols sped up the Middle East's economic decay that had already started, and the Turks and other nomadic peoples like the Circassians were largely responsible for. The Mongols depopulated areas like Iraq and Iran, both of which would remain wealthier in this timeline. The main effect of the Mongols upon Europe was in Russia. Russia was the only part of Europe the Mongols really held down for a long period of time. Russia was also the part of the Mongol Empire that was the most cruelly governed. The Mongols brutally taxed and oppressed the native Russian population. Modern Russia in its current rendition was formed by the Mongol conquest. Russia in the 12th century was almost indescribably different from the modern country. Russia in the year 1150 was filled with parliamentary governments, was glued into the rest of Europe's trade, had mostly free farmers and property rights in advance of the rest of the European continent. If I had to guess what part of Europe would end up becoming the wealthiest and most powerful in the year 2000 from the vantage point of the 12th century, I would have guessed Russia. The Mongols did a couple things to Russia. Firstly, they pulled it away from the rest of Europe's trade. They also crushed the developing capitalist and democratic sectors. They crushed the different principalities, generally moving towards having Moscow as their chief taxmaster for the Russian states, which effectively unified Russia. A big reason for the later antipathy between the Russian nobility and peasantry is that the Mongols interbred a great deal with the Russian nobility, and so it was easy for the nobles to view their own population as a different ethnic group, thus making later serfdom easier. The biggest effect the Mongols had in Russia was they terrified the living daylights out of the Russians. After 3 centuries under the Tatar yoke, Russia became terrified of nomadic incursions. The Russians had developed a hatred for the nomadic steppe tribes and did literally everything they could to expand as fast as possible in every direction, so to not let another group of Mongol wannabes hurt the Russian heartland ever again. Thus, an expansionist, not entirely Western, anti-capitalist, autocratic, and unified Russia came out of the Mongols. A Russia that culminated in the Soviet Union in our timeline. The big factor here is that Russia remains divided. The big winner from this situation would be Poland, who invaded Russia in the 16th century in our world and even seized Moscow. In this timeline, the Poles turned the divided Russian states into clients using Smolensk as their main vassal to control the region. However, there were deep structural issues with Poland-Lithuania which manifested strongly in the mid-17th century. Without Russia, Sweden conquers western Poland in the late 17th century like they nearly did in our timeline, while Russia rebels and takes the eastern sector. Russia ends up following the same trajectory as America did in our timeline. Russia is a capitalist, frontier, democratic society. With its immense size, fertile soil, and resources, Russia becomes the most powerful nation on Earth. At a certain point, Russia drives Sweden out of Eastern Europe and takes over a massive area of Eastern Europe. If there's a central theme to this timeline, it's that the Mongol conquest had the effects of promoting paranoid autocratic governments, since the Mongols were so awful that people wanted strong governments to keep something like them from ever happening again. All the regions the Mongols conquered resulted in heavily socially conservative governments, as people tried to regain the world before the Mongols killed 50 million people. In a lot of ways, this gave Western Europe, as the main center of Eurasian civilization that didn't get whacked, a huge advantage and made its world conquest much easier. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my merch, where I've got all sorts of stuff like cool maps, t-shirts, and mugs. Or alternatively, check out my Patreon at these wonderful patrons in front of you. There I've got the first 4 chapters of my cultural history of America, the first 11 chapters of my history of the world. We've also got cool maps and exclusive videos where you can ask what-if questions and have me answer. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.